Welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages, the writing podcast where we're not sure where we're going, but we're having an adventure.
This podcast contains adult themes and language at times.
At times? What fun is that?
And discretion is advised.
Welcome to this episode of Semi-Sages of the Pages.
Woohoo!
We're doing something special today, and we're actually interviewing one of my longtime friends, Jake. So welcome, Jake.
Welcome, Jake.
Hi there.
Hi, Jake.
Thanks for having me.
So a little bit of an introduction while we're talking about Jake is we talk a lot about writing, about the creative process, how you maybe world build, all that kind of stuff, storytelling. But there is a field in which the four of us semi-sages do not have much experience in, and Jake does. And that is the world of D&D and being a dungeon master. So we really wanted to get him in to talk about, it's a different type of world building, a different type of storytelling, and we wanted to pick his brain and get some insights from him. So Jake, if you could go and introduce yourself here.
Yeah, I went to college with Molly, and Molly is actually how I met my wife. So I am returning the favor, and I think this counts as us being even now.
Oh, it does this.
But there you go.
But no, I've been dungeon mastering since college. It's really the only form of creative writing that I have any real experience in. But I have been playing off and on for that whole time. With friends, with my brothers currently, actually. And it's just an awesome creative outlet that works very well with my personality and motivation.
When you say that it works well with your personality and motivation, what does that mean for you?
Well, for me, that means that I kind of suck at actual fiction writing. I've tried it a couple times, and it's very frustrating, and I always end up giving up very quickly. But the way that D&D works is you kind of, as a dungeon master, create a world, and then you and your friends get to improv in it. And coming up with basic ideas and then joking around, hanging out with friends is a lot more my speed.
Yeah, that's a really great point for our listeners out there who maybe aren't familiar with D&D and being a dungeon master. Can you give like a general overview so people understand what we're talking about?
Oh boy, can I. I have needed to explain this to relatives and to coworkers, and I have experience in the field of explaining what Dungeons and Dragons is. Basically, the way that it works is the Dungeon Master is kind of the writer of the situation, and 2, 3, 4, 5, however many friends hang out, each control a character. They create a character, they have a character sheet with their statistics, their backstory, etc., and I create a world for those characters to interact with. So there's no real script. There's rules for how characters can interact and things like that, but basically it's just collaborative improv. My characters will decide what they want to do, and then they'll roll some dice to add a little bit of randomness to it. And it's the Dungeon Master's job to explain how that role or how that choice affected the world around them. So it's not just fighting monsters and stuff like that. There's also role-playing as your character, interacting with non-player characters or NPCs. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's basically my job as the Dungeon Master to be every part of the world that isn't those characters. So I kind of write ahead of time a little bit of what I do, but mostly I just kind of have ideas that we go into it with and then improv together from there.
Yeah, so how much preparation, how much pre-work is there before you actually start a session?
For me, I'm kind of more of a loosey-goosey dungeon master than some of the others that I know. I go in with like maybe 1 page of bullet points and stuff like that. Maybe an hour or 2 of preparation for a session that can last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. Depends on how long we want to hang out. Because like I said, I'm playing with people that I've known all my life, and we're using it as an excuse to hang out as much as, you know, being creative. But my preparation is basically just bullet points, maybe a couple lines of dialogue for something that I want to be very specific about. But rather than writing out everything that happens, I try to have a good idea of what should happen based on what choices I think the players might make. Because at least once every session, they will completely get something out of left field that surprises me, and I have to adapt and make sure that I have an explanation that makes sense for how the world responds to their choices.
Oh, that's cool. So can you give us some examples of some of these bullet points?
Sure. So for example, the current campaign that I'm running with my cousins, we're playing a group of adventurers that have to try and unite all these rival city-states against one big army that's threatening them all. So basically what they're doing each session is they're going to a new little city-state and figuring out how can they influence this city-state to join the cause of the good guys. So in a recent episode, they came to a religious sanctuary city it's a big city up in the trees and stuff like that. So I write down some plot points like the elder tree is the boss of the town. It's a big sentient tree, and I write out a few personality traits so that I can improv his dialogue later.
That's cool.
Right, and I'll do the same for like a couple of the other priests that they meet and things like that. You know, I'll pick out 3 or 4 character traits that describe enough that I can improv as that character if need be.
So, Jake, how do you set your intent? Like, do you have to agree on that as a group, or as the dungeon master, do you set kind of the goal at the beginning?
Usually I come up with a hook at the beginning of, based on the way that this first interaction between our characters goes, we can tell that this is the overarching premise. So that for this particular try, what we came up with, or what I came up with for the characters to start with was they were conscripted by a military, and they go to try and defend a city against this big evil army, and they find out the whole city is destroyed, and this charismatic bad guy talks some trash to them and then disappears. So like they can tell that, okay, the overarching plot of what we're going to do is we got to track that charismatic bad guy down. And the individual small scale choices are more up to them in improvisation, but I generally have an idea and I make it clear that this is your end goal. This is what you guys should be working for. That part is on me, but like the day-to-day, what they want to do first, that kind of falls to the characters and how they want to interact.
So you're kind of creating almost an island, and you've got a wall up around the island, and you're like, all right, within these parameters, this is how you guys can function. But have fun. I mean, imagine whatever you want to imagine, but it's within these parameters, within these walls.
Yeah. So I give them a map and I say, here's a couple places you can go, and they get to decide what they want to do. But no matter what, like my main goal, of course, is to make the scenario happen in a way that is fun for the people playing. And one thing that I had a note on that I wanted to make sure I brought up. When you guys are writing fiction, you generally have an idea of who your audience is, right? But how nifty would it be if you knew the exact people that were reading your book? If you knew them personally, and you knew them your whole life, and you knew them growing up, and they were one of the closest people in the world to you, you would know exactly, or you'd have a better idea of how to write a story for them, right?
Yeah.
So that is part of the reason that it works so well when I'm playing with friends and family that are very close to me. I try to have a good idea of what they want to do within those parameters, like you said. Within these parameters, what do I know about my players that will make sure that they have a good time? And it also kind of helps me predict what choices they will make, so I can kind of plan for that too.
You know, that's interesting, because I think sometimes when you're writing, because writing is such a solitary task, you can have your, Stephen King calls it the ideal reader, and you can have that person in mind, but you can also go off the rails very easily because, hopefully your story is being read by hundreds, if not thousands of people, but you can't predict how they're going to respond because they're all strangers to you. Which is why I think sometimes books, especially by established authors, go out there and some of their readers hate it and they get bashed. And the authors are like, wait, I don't know what I did wrong. But it's because you can't predict how strangers are going to react.
I do also think, taking that in sort of a different direction, think about how well writers know our characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jay coming at this from the position of knowing his players so well that he can almost manipulate how they are going to react to certain things. So it's interesting to see how character development for D&D is so similar to our world building and our character building, because we know everything from our characters' blood types to, the way they take their coffee. And
though sometimes they can surprise us. Sometimes our characters will do stuff that we're like, why are you doing that?
Absolutely.
And usually they are correct. But it's interesting how the conscious and the subconscious work and interact with each other when you're in the midst of creating these characters and doing the world building, because they will surprise you sometimes.
Yeah,
Jake?
and they do almost every time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any good stories, like a quick story to tell us about something where you thought your characters, your friends, family were going to react in one way, and then it went completely off rails for you, and you had to, sort of like you said, improv on the spot and make sure that the way that they had reacted made sense for the world around them?
Well, I'm going to keep coming back to this campaign that we're playing right now because it's the freshest in my mind, but there was one time that a completely minor thing that I didn't actually intend to say was taken slightly out of context and completely changed how the characters wanted to do things. So I assumed that they were going to be going to the nearest town to them because that was kind of the overall plan that they had been working on. But just a tiny misspeaking on my part led them to think, oh, that must be a clue. So we have to go to this completely different city that you have to come up with on the fly because you only have a basic idea in your outline. You didn't actually plan for this session for them to go to that city. So things like that will pop up all the time, or things like I have 5 characters that I am helping manage, and I'm writing the story for, and I can't necessarily keep track very easily of every single thing they can do. I have a pretty good idea, but there was one time just recently where a character of mine had the perfect spell to counter the spell that this horrible, evil, super tough vampire was going to cast. And he just completely wiped out that. So now this fight becomes much easier. And I have to make it fun, but I also have to reward him for having the right spell. So I had to kind of improvise on the spot to have a different way to introduce a little bit of challenge, a little bit of fun to the battle, even though he completely annihilated my original plan by having the exact perfect spell ready to go.
So Jake, does that... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Does that mean that you want them to defeat your villains for the most part? Like, is the goal that every campaign they win, or sometimes do they not succeed in their campaign?
My philosophy is that I want them to win by the slimmest margin I can manufacture. In a campaign, when I say that word, what I'm talking about is like the whole setting that we're playing once a week for a couple months at a time or something. So overall, I don't want them to put in all that work and then just completely lose. But, session by session, maybe things don't turn out the way they want to. For example, maybe somebody they were trying to protect in a particular battle, that person doesn't make it out of the battle. Or maybe they try to solve a riddle the wrong way and it ends up making things more difficult for them in the short term. But for me, I definitely want to make sure that in the long run the players are are winning in the way that makes them have fun, but not necessarily is easy or a guarantee.
Now this
That's part of why, like in a video game or something like that, where you are the player, and the video game developer is trying to introduce difficulty, but only enough to make it fun. Sometimes you run into something that you just can't solve, or it becomes unfun, or what have you. And the benefit of having a dungeon master is like having the video game developer develop the video game as you're playing it to make it more fun for the way that you want to play it.
Now this to me really, like, I'm having my aha moment, Morgan, about how, like, when we write, sure, we can't really necessarily adapt on the fly, but there's still like this aspect of, you know, when someone reads a book, you want them to enjoy reading the book, even if they're not happy all of the time. And you set up these promises and these expectations of how it's going to go. And if you don't deliver on those expectations, right, you tell them that it's going to be a happily, like you project that it's going to be happily ever after. And then you get to the end and everyone dies. Like, people aren't going to enjoy that. You know, that's not going to be what they thought they were getting. That's not going to be satisfying or fulfilling to them.
Yeah, you even if you're trying to kind of do an M. Night Shyamalan kind of twist where you're like, oh, I can't believe that happened. You still have to you have to meet the requirements. You have to meet the agreements. You have to make the agreements that you've already made throughout the story. And yeah, you want to throw some twists in. You don't want to make it obvious. But if you turn it too much on its ear, you end up really frustrating your readers. They should be able to kind of be like, oh, I knew that was going to happen. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it though. That's really kind of the feeling that you want.
Yeah.
Not that they don't see it coming whatsoever, or it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's it doesn't make any sense is the one you want to avoid. And then the other aspect of this, if I can get my train of thought to catch up with my mouth, I can't. All right, I lost it. Sarah, you had something.
Gosh.
Or you didn't, whatever.
I did, but it's gone. It'll come back.
Wait, I remember. I was going to say basically that you can't make it too easy on the reader and on your characters.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're like Jake mentions, if everything is easy, if you know from the beginning that, you know, your character is going to walk away from every fight and everything's going to be great and roses, like, that's not satisfying either. It's not fun. I'm
not aiming for my character or my readers to get frustrated, but if they are, it shows that they're emotionally invested in the story. And, you know, we all have situations in our day-to-day activities where we will get frustrated. So if the reader is getting frustrated with the situation, or your players are getting frustrated within your D&D, it shows that they have that emotional investment in what's happening. Now, you don't want to keep that for a long span of time, and you want to give them some sort of sense of resolution pretty quickly. But I always found when I was reading, if I was getting frustrated with a character, it meant I cared about them.
Yeah. And the other, I lost my train of thought now too. You and I got it. Now I got it. And you and I, Sarah, were talking about likable versus unlikable characters. Because human beings are not 100% likable 100% of the time. They're not princesses, they're not princes, they don't always do the right thing. And you have to find that balance. And you have to decide. And I think I was talking to Morgan about this via text, because the most recent story I'm working on, my aptly titled Sacramento Ghost House Romance. I got to work on my title.
No, I think you should keep that.
I think so too. I can envision it on coffee mugs.
Right, exactly.
And it should be like hyphenated. Like the whole thing, just Sacramento Ghost House.
Sacramento Ghost House Romance. But I want my main character to be a little bit unlikable. She's very controlling. Her thought processes are not very positive. She's, very negative. But I can't go too far in that, because then her love interest won't have her love interest, it won't ring true. You know, he won't be able to fall in love with somebody who's so rigid in their thinking and so controlling. And I also don't want my readers to put the book down and be like, well, this character's a bitch.
Yeah.
But I want her to have that edge too. So it's been really fun and really challenging to figure her out.
That's a challenge I encountered with Gertrude, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping the next version of the story will help establish that balance a little bit better. But so, Jake, when you're designing characters too, do you try to design them from the Dungeon Master portrayal side? So like the characters that you are representing, do you ever come up with a character where you want your players to be misled by them? How do you sort of set that up?
Well, part of the way that I particularly write my D&D campaigns is I try to go mostly session by session, like it's a TV episode or something like that. So when I'm writing my NPCs, I always try to make sure that you get a decent feel for them very quickly. Something I like to call the Star Trek rule, where like in Star Trek, you know, you meet an alien race, they're going to have some wonky thing on their forehead, but they're otherwise going to look fairly human, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you need to have a couple tropes that just make it clear, oh, we're dealing with the warrior race guy, or we're dealing with the misunderstood bookworm, or, you know, things like that. Like, I need to make a very, very quick first impression so that the characters have an idea of who the person is that they're meeting. And that's where like I mentioned before, I generally have just a couple bullet points that I introduce so that they quickly have an idea. And then it's kind of case by case on what kind of session we're running, whether it becomes fleshed out or whether that person was just, you know, scenery.
Do you have people who participate with you? Do they fight? Like on the campaign, do they fight over making decisions?
I'm sorry. I just had the vision of like people sitting around a table, you know, actually like actually fighting. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works.
Oh yeah, we get real into the role-playing
I can
part.
tell you it gets aggressive. And it sucks when your character is not as powerful as the other ones, especially, and you're like, man, why are you doing that? And you try to take them on. It's just not a good idea.
Generally, we do pretty well. I give my players plenty of time, if they're interacting in character, to come to resolutions. And generally, the laid-back way that I run campaigns and that my players are interested in running the campaigns never really gets hostile. But there have been, you know, when there's disagreements, there's disagreements, and I give them time to work things out like that. But you did specifically mention like one character being more powerful than another or something. That is one of the things that I think is the easiest to let get out of control as a problem in an ongoing campaign.
Yeah.
So again, being somebody who can write it on the fly and can adjust chapter by chapter of what the story is supposed to be about, maybe my fire mage character is feeling a little put out because he doesn't do as much damage as the barbarian with the gigantic hammer or something, right? So now what if the next time that we come across a bad guy, it's something that flies and the barbarian can't hit him with his hammer? Or what if it's something that's particularly flammable? Or, you know, I can adapt it so that each guy can have their day in the sun and not make it too easy for one person to be the main character. Because that's another thing that to avoid conflict, you want to make sure everybody is involved and everybody feels like they are the main character, at least enough that, you know, they're having fun with it.
Yeah. And to me, it's interesting because many stories, and then D&D as well, often operates with sort of like a 5-man band concept, right? There's a group of people. Now, when you're writing a story, you have the advantage of being able to pick your characters and saying like, all right, I need 5 characters, and this character is going to fulfill this role, and this character is going to fulfill this role, and, you know, so forth. But I guess I want to hear more from you, Jake, about like you don't pick the character. Your participants pick their characters and decide how their characters are going to be. So you don't get to you're given sort of a 5-man band, but it's not necessarily the 5-man band that you want. I'd love to hear more about how you have to figure out what they're doing and how they've assembled a team and how you deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Earlier in my dungeon mastering career, if you want to be fancy enough to call it that, there were enough mishaps that I've decided from now on forever, we all come up with our characters and we build them together.
Oh, I like that.
Because that's generally the first session of any campaign that I do. Is I give them a little primer on what's going on, what the hook is, what the setting is, things like that. And then we work together to make sure that we don't all pick Fire Mage or something like that, right? Because that would be like, a band of 5 little elves wandering around shooting fireballs, and then the first thing that gets up close to them just instantly knocks them all out. Like, that would be silly, right? You want to have variety, and you also want to make sure that everybody gets to play what they feel like playing. So generally the way that we start that is we kind of say, like, okay, what does everybody feel like this time as far as your character? We kind of start with what kind of combat role do you want? So like, I want to be the big guy, or I want to be the sneaky guy, or something like that. That's kind of where the generation of the party begins, and we all just work together, make compromises if we have to. But generally, like, the fun of the role-playing part of it outside of combat, the personality of each of these characters can be completely whatever you want. So that there really isn't much need to worry about overlap. But like in combat roles, that's where we want to make sure we have a good mix of people. But yeah, as far as like a 5-man band goes, there really isn't. You always want to try to avoid having one person that is very obviously a leader. You can have somebody within the group who is kind of playing that role, just, with the agreement of everybody else that they're going to kind of start off as like maybe the captain of a military group or something, rather than just one of the privates, something like that. But, you don't necessarily have to have somebody in charge in order to still have like traditional 5-man band type.
Yeah. Well, I like that, because then, why would you play a D&D campaign if you know that your character is just a support character to the quote-unquote main character? That wouldn't be nearly as fun.
And like, when you're writing a story, you wouldn't write it where all 5 of your 5-man band are the big dumb guy, right? But if you're...
I kind of want to now.
Yeah, right? Maybe I should take that back.
But no, in general, you wouldn't do that, yeah.
Exactly. You would come up with enough variety to make your story interesting, to make your party a good group that meshes together. And the only real way that I understand to do that with people who are collaborating on a D&D type thing is to make that the first time that we get together. And we have to flesh out our characters together and make sure we cover all the roles. And I give a little guidance, but like, my favorite thing is when they're all creating characters and they're all getting into their backstory, and somebody goes, oh crap, we don't have anybody that's sneaky. So then everybody has to rethink what they want to do and readjust together. And as a team, come up with a balanced group that can handle any situation they think might be coming.
So do you have an example of maybe one of your players and like a favorite character that someone has created?
I think I would say, I don't know. I'm trying to think back. I have probably played probably close to 100 different characters have come through my campaigns. I think the one that sticks out to me though is, I can't remember if this is the very first or the second one that I ran. Maybe that character came back once or twice because he was so beloved. But my best man at my wedding, Tyler, who's been my best friend all the way back to high school here, but he in video games or anything like where he gets to pick his character, he always wants to be the healer, which is weird in D&D because normally it's kind of a battle for who has to be the healer, because you got to have somebody who can do a little bit of healing, but a lot of people consider it boring. But Tyler, because it's his personality, he's basically like the support role of the party in real life. He wanted to play a cleric who just did absolutely the top-notch healing, and he went out on all sorts of limbs to find different ways that he could be better at it. and he made his character, who spoke with a German accent, whose name was Hans Dieter von Grossen-Wolfenhaus.
Awesome.
And that has been this is pushing 10 years ago, and I still remember this character very clearly. He was exactly what Tyler's personality was in real life, and I think that's what made him so endearing. And just the extra thought that goes into silly details like that stupid long name, and all the little extra adventures he went on to get better at something that most people don't really want to do. I think that might be my favorite example of a character that fits the player and is exactly what Tyler should play in a game like that.
Aww.
So question, as a dungeon master, what kind of resources do you have for, because I know that there are books and stuff like that, but I don't really understand. Tell me about how these resources, what they do for you. How do you find them? I'm not even phrasing this question quite right.
Well, like what stuff do I have on hand while I'm
what helps you?
Or?
What helps
Sure.
you figure out how to world build? What helps you come up with, like, what can the characters can and cannot do? Because those are rules that are set in place. They're not rules that you necessarily have to create all of the time.
Uh-huh.
Right? There are character types that the players can choose from. Like what is inside your control, what is already like pre-prescribed based off of the rules of D&D, and then what kind of resources do you have to run these sessions? Does that make sense?
Basically the only thing that is scripted out in the rules is fighting. So like in battle, when it is your turn to have your character act, these are the things you can do. That's all pretty written out specifically. The dice come into play, but like the basic idea of D&D is when you try to do something, you roll a 20-sided die and add whatever your skill modifier is. So like maybe our sneaky guy is trying to sneak in through a window. He would roll a d20 and he would add 5 or whatever for his stealth roll. And the dungeon master, I would tell him if his result is good enough to do it quietly or something like that. So the actual fighting, though, I hit this guy with my axe and it does X damage. That stuff is all prescribed out in rule books that I generally have open on my computer when I'm playing, or I have there are websites. Certain versions of the rules are free online, and that's a little bit less unwieldy than trying to go through a 300-page PDF. But either way, I have those rule books open in case there's a situation in combat that comes up where I'm not quite sure what the rules are. Like if one of my characters tries to tackle somebody and just not kill him, but just like grapple him, restrain him, or something like that. Rules like that I might not be super familiar with, so I'll have rule books open and available for that. But other than that, pretty much everything is up to me. So I brought up Star Trek before. Star Trek is an excellent resource if you are trying to be a dungeon master, because every hour-long episode, for the most part, is completely separate from the other ones, and it introduces a somewhat brief story hook on a new planet or something that they reach. And there's this very quickly introduced political situation that the characters have to solve, or something like that. Star Trek is kind of like not what I'm basing my dungeon mastering on literally, but kind of structurally. So you want to have your ideas put together before you actually start the sessions, of course. But resources like other TV shows that are episodic like that are kind of the resources I use when I'm planning. So I'll take elements from different elements and inspirations from different places that I see them, and combine them into something that is new.
So it's the idea.
That's kind of my. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Oh, I was just going to say that's sort of my overall process. There is that's what I do in between episodes to write stuff, and then during the episodes, I let the characters decide within those parameters that I've created what they want to do.
So it's kind of the idea that so many TV shows use of the monster of the week. So Buffy used it. Star Trek's a good example. Supernatural is a good example, where again, it's those, you have the parameters, and here's something you have to fix or fight or solve or whatever. And then when the campaign's done, it's done.
Sure. Yeah. So like I'll write my individual sessions like they're an episode of one of those shows, and then I'll write my campaign like it's a season. We can come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can come back to that, another season with the same characters if they want. But generally, I found the way to avoid getting burnt out and, having a campaign fade away and we stop playing it or something is limited to like maybe 6 months or so like that, And then if you want to play with those characters again, we can do it, but have a natural jumping off point so that nobody who's losing interest feels pressured to stay the same thing forever.
Gotcha. Cool.
But yeah, the monster of the week absolutely is the name of the trope that I was trying to think of that I couldn't get there. But so you got to mix it up though and make sure it's not always a monster though, right? Like it
Right.
can't always be just fight this thing and then you win and then I'll see you next week. For example, I think my 2 favorite episodes that we've done, 2 favorite sessions in this current campaign, we actually had almost no fighting. One of them was a murder mystery house, and one of them was a dungeon that had like rooms, adjacent rooms they had to work their way through, and each room had some riddle that they had to solve in it, some physical task or
cool.
something like that. So
And I'm
things like
assuming-
that I intersperse with big battles.
So I'm assuming you had to come up with like all the riddles and make sure like the format worked when you did, or like a murder mystery, you would have had to know beforehand who committed the murder and like leaving clues and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So for the murder mystery one, I had enough clues that they had a good idea who did it, but not really why. And that introduced another problem with, if you're writing fiction, you can say that, Lieutenant Columbo found this clue or made this phone call or something off screen, and then he comes back on camera at the end and he accuses the guy and he has the proof, right? But if you're writing a puzzle for other people to solve, you have to be able to adapt it on the fly if they just do not pick up on something that you thought was obvious. Which happens every time, I guarantee it. There's something that I thought would be obvious when I was writing it that does not become obvious. So I kind of have to over-prepare how many clues there are and stuff like that.
That's pretty funny.
So, question, Jake, if someone is listening in and they're like, this sounds exciting, this sounds great, and they wanted to get involved in D&D, they wanted to try it out, I'm assuming first it's best to start as a character before you jump into being a dungeon master. But how does someone get involved and decide they want to do this?
Basically, you just got to be a nerd who is not self-conscious about possibly the nerdiest hobby out there socially. So
I think cosplay is pretty nerdy too.
Oh, that's a good point. That's probably
I think that's the next step. Yeah.
Yeah. Or cosplaying as your D&D character. Maybe that's like the
That's
Who does that?
LARPing.
Certainly. Like what?
Oh,
LARPing.
yeah.
LARPing
Yeah.
is just the
Honestly,
next
though-
stage of this, though.
Yeah, it's playing D&D in real life. Yep. But
And you get to
Kind of
dress up,
amazing.
so it's really like combining things.
yeah. it's all sorts of the all different points of the nerd universe collaborating into one activity. I would say, like, if you wanted to yeah.
Yeah.
If you wanted to start D&D, though, what I would recommend when I started there 10 years ago, give or take, there wasn't really a whole lot going on as far as ways that you could observe it without just diving in. But right now we are in we're in the golden age of podcasts, but specifically we are living in the golden age of Dungeons and Dragons podcasts. There are hundreds of them. And you can just jump in with one of those and kind of learn how it flows, how the characters interact and things like that. I would certainly recommend giving that a shot to see if it sounds like it would be fun. But after that, it's basically just look up the rules online and see if you can, or buy a book physically if you want to. But just really motivation giving it a shot is really the only thing that's stopping people who feel like this would be interesting.
Awesome. And Jake, I guess this is an appropriate place where you should maybe plug some of the stuff you're doing, because this ties in with some of the things you're doing.
Do you mean the D&D bonus episodes we run on my own podcast, Molly? Is that potentially what you're bringing up?
Yeah, tell people about your podcast and your D&D episodes that you run.
Yeah, my podcast, short version of it, it's sports talk radio for sumo wrestling. We follow the sport and we talk about current events and such like that. Just like every other sport, right now we're kind of in a dead zone because of cancellations and stuff like that. But one of the things that we do to kill time in between sumo tournaments and things like that is we run a D&D style role-playing game that I think we've put out maybe 4 episodes now that are around a half hour, 45 minutes each, where I'm playing as the dungeon master, and each of my other 3 co-hosts on the sumo podcast, they've each created a sumo wrestler character that they're playing as.
That's awesome.
So we're not using Dungeons and Dragons rules. We actually the sumo internet community is really weird and really, really deep if you want to look into it. Somebody actually came up with like a fully fleshed out role-playing game for conducting sumo wrestling matches, like with tens of dice and spreadsheets and all sorts of junk. Like, it's fully legit and it's awesome. But we use this guy's system that he came up with, and that's how we run our matches. And then the in-between stuff, we role play as our particular sumo wrestler, interacting with each other and with the other wrestlers and such in between matches and all that. So that just thanks for bringing that up, Molly, because that's just an example of, you don't have to play Lord of the Rings or a Harry Potter style setting. Like, it doesn't have to have magic. It doesn't have to have really life or death fighting or anything. It could just be built around doing wrestling matches. The idea of tabletop role-playing games is the overarching category here, is just collaborative improv where one person comes up with the story and everybody else acts it out together.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. I think we're going to start wrapping up here a little bit because Jake has another interview that he has to do for his own podcast. Do you have any final comments before we start with our wrap up here, Jake?
Not really. I guess my last little bit of advice that I don't know if I mentioned here, if anybody else wants to be a dungeon master, if you want to create something original, just find different things that already exist and combine them to make a nice gimmicky fun little setting. One thing that I did for my brothers one time when we were playing is we did like a classic Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons stereotypical city, except for the players were superheroes.
Oh, nice.
So instead of being like a wandering band of people with swords, they are introducing all sorts of superhero tropes. And those are 2 types of settings that everybody has a lot of ideas about and they're very familiar. But when you combine them, you can get new fun stuff and make a setting that's very interesting. Just as a world building tip, and then use the tropes of those different settings to flesh out your city, and it'll look like you came up with your own idea and you look real smart.
Oh, cool. Good
I love
advice.
looking real smart.
It's the best.
Yeah.
It's just great.
Jake, thank you so much for sharing this. Like, so exciting and fun, and what a great thing for people to get into, like, right now. No better time.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm just glad that there is a niche where my experience is actually interesting and useful. It doesn't happen often with D&D.
All right. So I think we're going to get into our thanks. Don't leave yet, Jake.
Okay.
Who has people they want to thank here?
I want to thank Jake again. That was really interesting and fun. And I love how my aha moment from him was taking things that are out there and then just putting them together in a unique way. Because I think sometimes as authors, we try to overthink it and that can shut us down. And
no,
I like
that
how
never
just
happens.
Opens, right? Exactly. And you get so frustrated that you kind of maybe quit. And I think he just I just loved listening to him because it reminded me the whole point is just to have fun, you know? As authors, we're just having fun with our characters. And I don't know, I just had this big aha moment about don't take it so seriously, just enjoy the journey. And so Jake, I just really wanted to thank you for that. And I'm Morgan, and you can check us out on Twitter, and I hope you do.
And I'm Teresa, and you can check us out on our Facebook, not www. Check us out on our Facebook, semisagesofthepages.com.
You can check out our www at semisages.
Wow, start that over.
Pages.com. No, I think we just do it, like roll with it. No. How did we not introduce ourselves in the beginning?
Whatever.
If you're listening, you know who we are.
Just deal with it. Just check us out on the social media and the webpage. I would like to thank actually one of our friends of the podcast, Andy. He made a suggestion that we end our episodes with a writing or creativity prompt. You can check out Andy. He has a website. It is www.logophilius.com, which is LOGOPHILIUS. In that vein, we actually asked Jake if he would come up with a bit of a creativity writing prompt for you guys. So Jake has that ready for us. Go, Jake.
If you were to write a Dungeons and Dragons campaign for this podcast crew, to explore together, what kind of setting would you like to use?
I love that.
All right. Thank you, wonderful Jake, for joining us. Give us, if listeners want to hear more from you, they want to check you out, where do they go?
You can look up Grand Sumo Breakdown. That's the name of my sumo podcast. And among the episodes, you won't see it listed as D&D because that's copyrighted. But we use some sumo vocabulary to get around that. Look for our bonus episodes called Doyos and Deshis. Those are the ones where we actually do D&D style role playing. But if you are interested in sumo at all, just search Grand Sumo Breakdown on whatever social media platforms you like, or find us on Stitcher and Apple Podcasts and all that.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thanks for listening. I think this has been another episode.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Semi-Sages of the Pages. Music used in the introduction was the song 5 Armies by Kevin MacLeod, which you can find at incomptech.com. It is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0, which can be found at creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. Whew, that's a wrap.
I hope it's been another episode.
If not, then I'm still sleeping.
Great dream,
All right.
though.
I'll call this a wrap up and I'll make it edit to sound like we sounded good at the end. It'll be great.
No, you guys nailed it. It was great.